Welcome to Sisters in Crime Australia and Murder Mondays, where authors talk about their crime craft. I'm Karina Kilmore, a debut crime writer, a journalist, and a national convener for Sisters in Crime, and we've been celebrating women's crime writing since 1991. Before I introduce Ann Cleeves, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Welcome, Ann. We're so honoured to have you here with us today. You have so many fans in Australia. In fact, we almost have a whole Sunday night of TV dedicated to you and your writing. We have both Shetland and Vera on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation every Sunday. And then there is your new book series, of course, Two Rivers, set in the North Devon where you grew up. It introduces us to the reserved and complex Detective Inspector Matthew Venn. And we're excited that it has also been optioned by Silver Prince Pictures. Welcome again, Ann. Before we get to the questions, can you please give us your elevator pitch for your latest novel, The Darkest Evening?
Yeah, The Darkest Evening is a Vera novel, and it's set in winter, our winter. So Vera's driving home from work. There's a blizzard, really, really heavy snow. So she loses her way a bit and just for a moment panics. She's not entirely sure where she is and sees a car that seems to have slewed off the side of the road. She stops to go and see if she can help. The driver's door is open and there's nobody inside. She assumes that the driver has gone off to find a phone signal to get help. And then she hears a cry and there's a toddler strapped in the back of the car. And that's how it starts. And it's a country house murder mystery, really.
Wow.
And we learn a little bit more about Vera's family.
I'm intrigued about Vera's family, her background, so that's good. She's a little bit of a mystery, isn't she?
Okay, a bit, but we find out a little bit more in this about Hector, her father, who was a black sheep in a minor county gentry type family. And so, yeah, that's
lovely.
What it found.
Ooh. Okay, let's get to the questions. Tell us something not in your book about a main character.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think I know quite a lot about all of them, and there are things. So you think about them really, and they seem to ferment in your mind, so that when you start writing them, it's almost as if you're writing from memory rather than imagination. So it's quite hard really to think of something that doesn't appear in the book that I know. But maybe we can talk about Vera. So I know, for instance, that her mum was a village school teacher. I can see her very clearly, very motherly, a bit plump. She died when Vera was very, very young. And so all that is there in my head. And Vera has this emptiness, this hole, because she never knew her mother. And she thinks that life would be different, that she would be a very different woman if her mother had been alive when she was growing up.
Oh, gosh. How important is place in your writing?
Place is always where I start off. So before I think of a story or a list of characters, I decide where the book's going to be set. And because I've finished writing about Shetland now, the decision will be whether it's a Vera book set in Northumberland here, or whether it's a Matthew Venn book set down in North Devon. And because I like to alternate, that decision is pretty well made for me. So when I come to the end of a Vera book, I get quite excited because it means I can do a jaunt down to North Devon, which is where I grew up, where I spent all my childhood and teenage years, and catch up with old friends. And then when I get to the end of a Matthew novel, I think, oh, that's good, I can go home to the Vera now. But I think that place is much more important than just a pretty setting at the back to provide a background for the story. My daughter's an academic, she's a human geographer, and I think that's what I do really, look at how place affects community and individuals. because I think we are the product of where we grew up, where the streets where we played and the people that we met, and the view that we saw through our window affects who we are. And
wow.
so I always say to new writers, just think about place, think about how those communities affect the individual characters that you're creating. I can't imagine Jimmy Perez coming from anywhere other than Shetland, for instance.
Yeah.
And Matthew Venn wouldn't have developed out of a very different community from the one that he grew up with in North Devon.
Yeah, fabulous. Well, this is leading on from that. Do you start with plot or character or something else? You start with place.
So I do start with place, and of course, one of the reasons why I'm still writing about Vera rather than because Shetland's quite small. There are only 23,000 people who live in Shetland, and although it's the archipelago's got lots of islands and it's about 100 miles from top to bottom, it's still quite limited in the sort of story opportunities, I suppose. Whereas here in Northumberland, we have the really beautiful moorland and the beaches and the castles and Hadrian's Wall and the rivers. But we also have quite an interesting post-industrial landscape because we used to have pits, the Coals to Newcastle thing. And we built ships, and we don't do that anymore. So there are patches of real deprivation in the southeast of the county. So that gives me a really wide palette. So really it's deciding that decision about where the book's going to be set will decide what sort of story it's going to be. Is it going to be like The Darkest Evening, the new book, a contemporary twist on a country house murder mystery, because rural Northumberland is still quite feudal and we have these big houses? Or is it going to be slightly gritty and more noir and set in one of the pit villages or one of the slightly unglamorous seaside towns in the south of the county?
What's the best way to dig yourself out of a bad plot hole?
We've all done that, especially me, because I never plot in advance. So quite often I get to the middle and I really struggle, and it's like wading through blancmange those days. I go for long walks because I think just that movement helps somehow to shift something in your head. And while you're walking, you're not doing anything else. You're not, well, I'm not listening to music. I'm not thinking about other things. I'm not answering emails or looking at social media. I'm just walking and just letting the story turn over in my head. And sometimes when you're walking, you come across a spot that will help you through the plot. I can remember, again, with The Darkest Evening, I was really stuck and I was walking through a bit of forest here and came to a forest clearing. And that sounds very green and very gorgeous, but here it was a bit of Clearfell, and the Forestry Commission had been and dug up all these huge pine trees and had left behind the roots and some of the trunks, and they were sticking out of the ground and it looked more like a graveyard. They were very white, they cried white. So it looked very dramatic and quite eerie, and that provided enough of an idea to get me out of the plot hole.
So again, that's place inspiring your plot in a way, isn't it? Yeah,
I think so.
How do you write about sex?
Well, Vera doesn't have a lot, so that's easy. I think and the Matthew books are more tricky because Matthew's gay, has a husband, very happily married man, and so I think that I write about feeling and emotion rather than the physical, because it's so easy to get physical sex wrong, and so it'd be cringeworthy, and it would be so difficult to write. I mean, it would be horrendous if you wrote a bad sex scene. So I try to avoid the physical, but I hope I can convey a sort of intensity of feeling. And with the first Matthew Venn book, the long call, I got 3 gay couples to read it before I was happy to send it off to the publisher. I just didn't want to offend or not be authentic or to get the tone wrong. And I didn't want the readers to feel that I was appropriating experiences that weren't true for me. So yeah, I try to be very careful.
Yeah. What is your writing routine?
I'm a very early riser.
Mm-hmm.
I'm usually awake by 5 a.m.
Wow.
I don't get up immediately, but I'll make lots of tea and I sit at my kitchen table and I write using a laptop. And I don't, as I say, I don't do synopses, I don't plot in advance, I just start.
Wow. What research did you do for your latest novel?
My research really it's pleasant. I'm where I am, so I listen to other people's conversations in pubs and in cafes and on the street and talk to friends. And so it's trying to work out what the preoccupations, again, of the place where I'm setting the book are, to get a sense of the rhythm of speech, especially if I'm going back to, if I'm writing in Shetland or in North Devon more recently, because that's not so familiar to me. And though I don't write in dialect, I think there is something about the way people speak that place them and root them and make them more real to the reader. So, for example, if I were in Northumberland, a term of affection would be pet, or it would be hinny. And in North Devon, it would be lover. How are you, my lover? Whether you're talking to a man or a woman, that's how it would be. So it's just, I suppose, picking up on those small details that bring a character to life. If I have a question about forensics, I don't research it beforehand. For me, the story is the most important thing. So once the story's done, if there's something that I'm not very sure about, then I've got some wonderful friends who I'll contact. So Helen Pepper, who's a crime scene manager, and Lorna Dawson, who's a forensic soil scientist, and the wonderful James Grieve, who's a forensic pathologist. So yeah, I'll phone them up and, can you just help me? What would I do if? And I'm writing a new Matthew book at the moment. So it was, James, I want somebody killed with a shard of glass. Would that work, or would the glass shatter when you put it into the body? And so he's very helpful.
This is why your phone calls aren't tapped.
Yeah, that might be a bit scary.
Why
he works in Aberdeen, so well, of course it would work. I've seen enough glassings in pubs, people who smash a bottle and then stick it in. Yeah, you could certainly kill people with a shard of glass.
Gosh. Why is crime so appealing as a genre?
I think crime's so appealing because it's good storytelling. The story moves on relatively quickly. You can't be self-indulgent really writing a crime novel. You have to take it seriously, take the story seriously. And you can't be too pretentious because your readers won't put up with it. And certainly other crime writers would just poke fun. So that helps a lot. But I think now contemporary crime fiction covers such a wide spectrum, from books that are quite quiet and domestic, almost literary, to books that are really pacey, of thrillers. So I think for new writers, because you have that structure of the plot, for me, that structure of traditional crime fiction, you have the body, you have a limited number of suspects, and you have some form of resolution at the end. That means that I don't really have to worry about plot. And it liberates me to look at what I'm really interested in, which is about community and what holds them together and what breaks them apart, and about families. And digging back into a family, a sort of psychological archaeology to find out what happened in the past that is causing stresses and tensions in the present.
Oh, wow.
So I think it's great for readers, but it's also, I think it's a wonderful genre for a new writer, because you have that, it's almost like a corset to hold you up if you want it, that structure. And if you want to subvert that, then that's fine too. So, and people love it. People understand it, I think, because of all the television, because of the Poirots and the Miss Marples and the Wallander and all the wonderful TV shows that there've been. People, it's quite familiar to readers. So even people who are new to reading for pleasure, it doesn't put them off. It's very accessible, and I love that. I love that new readers come to crime, and then they can decide if there are other genres that they prefer.
Yeah, it is. It's very inclusive, isn't it?
It is.
How much of you is in one of your characters?
I don't think I'm in one. I'm not in any of them, and I'm in all of them. I think writing is very like acting. You know, you stand inside the shoes, don't you? And that makes you become that person, and you see the world through their eyes. And it's not just the heroes or the lead characters that you do that with. It's with any, even of the minor characters. You need to understand them, so you need to get inside their skin and see the world through their eyes. And again, that's something that's really important for new writers, that you have to take that time to understand your character, to understand that you don't need to put all the detail in, as your very clever first question. You don't need to tell readers everything about them, but if you can't step inside their skin and understand them, then it's not going to seem real to the reader.
Yeah, beautiful. What's the hardest part about writing a novel?
The middle bit, I think. Especially, as I said, I never plot in advance. So I get halfway through and I think, how am I going to end this story? Who's the murderer? What's happening? Am I ever going to finish this book? This is just such a nightmare. Why did I start it? Why did I do this? So yeah, the middle bit is really tough. About 50,000 words in, 40 to 50,000 words in, that's where the real struggle, and that's where you just have to take time out and just think about it and run through, a bit like a detective, really, running a crime scene, running an investigation. You have to work through various scenarios. Well, maybe this happened. Let's have a look at how it would pan out if this person was the murderer and this is what happened. So there's a lot of what ifs. And my friend Helen, who is the crime scene manager, says that that's what they do when they come to a crime scene. They play out all these different scenarios. What might have happened that would explain the evidence that they have at the scene, at the locus.
Wow, that's a great tip. Would you write a crime book about the pandemic? That's
really tricky, because I'm just coming to the end of a crime book now, and so when I started it there was no pandemic. And now, and I thought by the time it's published, by the time it comes out, which will be a year in September, then it'll all be over, because we all thought it was going to be a one-off thing. You know, it would be dreadful when it happened. We'd lock down, it would go away, and then life would continue as normal. And I think we've all realised that it's not that sort of virus, that it will come back, and until we have an effective vaccine. So it might well be that we're still affected by the pandemic in 2021, but I'm assuming not. I'm assuming that things are back to normal. So I do have people hugging each other, which seems very weird to write that. And people sitting in bars and chatting and all the things that most of us are quite reluctant to do at the minute. But it would have been, I would have had to have, you would have had to guess what it would be like. And I think it's that it was just safer to assume that it hadn't happened, or it was all over by the time the book comes out. Yeah. And the book that comes out in September, The Darkest Evening, that was completely finished a year ago. So yeah, that's not mentioned at all.
No, Yeah. How do
I
you
know
write
Velvet just decided she's going to set her next book in 1979, so she doesn't have to worry
Yes,
about that
that's
stuff.
right.
I think there'll be quite a lot of people doing that.
Yeah. We'll have a time warp.
Yeah.
How do you write about violence?
Again, I don't want to glorify it. And I think quite often the understated description of violence is actually more frightening than a graphic description. And I'm really more interested in the effect that violence has on the victim and the victim's family, or the friends and family of the victim. So it's looking at an aftermath. It's what happens to those individuals afterwards, rather than glorifying the act itself. I didn't write it, but a wonderful scriptwriter called Gabby Chappie did one of the Shetland storylines about the rape of a very confident young police officer. And they did such research. They went and spoke to Rape Crisis, and they asked the victims, the survivors of rape, what would you like us to do? How would you like us to do it? And they all said, don't show the attack itself. Because if there are survivors out of there, that will just bring back the trauma. Some men can get off on it. You don't want to titillate those people who do. And what they did was show that how this young, bright, confident woman changed completely in personality as a result of it, and the struggle she had to come back to try and regain herself, who she really was. And I think that was much more effective than showing, that an assault and then everything coming back to normal immediately afterwards, which is what sometimes seems to happen in the more violent books and the more violent TV shows.
That's right. Yeah. How many drafts do you write before handing it in?
That varies, and I write more drafts at the beginning than the end, because, as I say, I haven't been plotting in advance. So about halfway through, I'll suddenly realise how it's going to end and what's happening. So I'll need to go back and rewrite bits then to make it all work and make it hang together. So the last chapter probably gets very, very few rewrites at all. And so it sort of works its way through. And then once I finished what I think is a complete draft, it will then go to both my agents, my US and my UK agent, because they work together. They're co-agents, they're colleagues. And that's very useful because I get joint notes back then. So they'll collaborate on providing me with the notes, so I won't get bombarded by different opinions. They'll come to a decision themselves. And so I'll consider that and rewrite that and think about it. And it's really important to listen at that point, because you're so close to the book. You've spent 9 months with it, maybe. These characters so well that you forget to tell the reader stuff. Yeah. Because they're perfectly formed in your head, but the reader might not actually understand or see what you see. So then it goes to my 2 editors, my UK and my US editors get it at the same time. And again, because they're both part of the Macmillan Group, Pan Macmillan in the UK, Minotaur in the States, they work jointly to provide notes. So again, it's usually pretty clean by the time it gets to them.
Yeah.
There's not too much to do at that point.
Yeah. How much of a profile do you do for each character before you write them?
Again, that depends. Some characters come to life only when I write them, and then I need to think about them a bit as they develop as I'm writing. Returning characters, obviously, I know very, very well. So Vera, Jo, Holly in the Vera series, Matthew, Jen, and Ross in North Devon. I understand those very well. But no, some of them do develop as I'm writing. And again, that sometimes need me to go back and rewrite to make sure that I think they're credible and they hold together. because you can't have a character doing something that would be completely out of character, even though it's very, very convenient for the plot.
Yeah.
So you do have to go back and look at it again and rewrite it.
Who's your favourite crime fiction character?
That's a really interesting question. I love Sarah Paretsky's V.I. Warshawski because she's so brave. She does all that stuff that I just wouldn't have the nerve to do. And she's also really fit. Like, she's up all night doing surveillance. And then she's jogging the next morning. I'd still be in bed, sorry for myself. And she gets beaten up and she's still there, back there fighting for justice. I love her.
I have to agree. How do you approach representing diverse communities in your writing?
That's really difficult, isn't it? And I live in 2 areas, the north of England and writing in North Devon and in Shetland, where there is very little diversity. And that's sad, I think. I love that buzz of meeting different people and people from different backgrounds and trying to understand them. I found it relatively easy to write a gay couple, even though I'm a straight woman, because the people who looked after me, my husband died a couple of years ago, and our closest friends and the people who scooped me up from the hospital and took me to their flat and fed me wine and sympathy and really looked after me and are still looking after me years after, were Martin and Paul, a gay couple who got married in Shetland not very long ago, but who live in Northumberland. And so they were in my head when I was writing. And although I didn't actually set out at the beginning to make Matthew gay, because they were there rattling around in my mind and I was just spending so much time with them. That's how that happened.
Yeah.
And I suppose if we're talking about diversity as well, a different form of diversity in the long call, there's a young woman with Down syndrome too, and I really wanted to make that right. So I went to talk to someone I know who has a daughter, a young woman with Downs, and I went, and one of my very close friends has worked with adults with a learning disability all her career, and so and obviously talked to Izzy, the young woman with Down syndrome herself, about all sorts of things, really, just chatting. And they seem content with the portrayal in the book. I think content that people with a learning disability aren't seen as one block, that everybody's individual and everybody has a different level of ability and disability. And it makes a difference if you've been to a mainstream school, and it makes a difference if you've been to a special school. And in that book, I'm looking also at about independence, and it's in my head at the moment because I'm writing the second North Devon Matthew Venn book. And in that, Lucy Braddock, who's the Izzy character, is moved on to independent living. Mm-hmm. And so she is a returning character. She's not just in there for one book and then will disappear. She's a returning character. And if there is a TV adaptation, I think she'll certainly be a large part of that too.
Fabulous. Oh, that's great. Who are your literary inspirations?
There's so many, goodness. That's something, again, that you need to tell writers, I think, that when people are starting off, you need to read. Because how do you know what sort of book you want to write if you don't read? Okay, literary inspirations. I wasn't a great Agatha Christie fan as a young reader. Mm-hmm. I think she is very cold and she's very ruthless, and she does kill schoolgirls. She wrote serial killers before some of the real hard-hitting male writers.
Yeah.
And so I could never really get on with her. So I suppose I fell in love, like everybody, with Lord Peter Wimsey and Harriet Vane. And I think Gaudy Nights, which is a Gaudy Night, which is one of those stories. It's a love story, really. It's a very, very crap detective story. It doesn't work, but it does work as a love story, and that respect that Peter has for the intelligence and the independence of Harriet is lovely throughout the books, I think.
Yeah.
But I love lots of the Scandi writers. I was a great Henning Mankell fan for ages. Yeah. So, but it was mostly crime, even though I read really widely.
Yeah.
It was the crime that I always went back to. It was my comfort reading always.
Yeah. Drawn to it.
Yeah.
Does your main character ever surprise you?
No, I am the god in my universe. I control what's going on. So I don't think they do, really. There might be a plot twist, or there might be some small mellowing of Vera, but like when she picks up the toddler in the snow, she's really quite gentle with it, quite taken with it. Though she can't tell whether it's a boy or a girl. She's calling it.
That's so Vera.
But I do control what's going on the pages.
Yeah. What started you on your life of crime?
Well, I was. It started really because I met my husband when I was working in Fair Isle, which is one of the more remote of the Shetland Islands, and he came as a visiting birdwatcher. And soon after we got married, he got a job as warden of this tiny nature reserve. It was a tiny little island off the west coast of England, between the Wirral Peninsula on Merseyside and North Wales. And we were the only residents living there. We had no mains electricity, no mains water. You could only get to the mainland by walking across the sand and the mud at low tide, or we had this very temperamental tractor that we drove across sometimes. So stuck there on the island, if you're not into natural history, and I really wasn't, there's not a lot to do. So that was a good place to start. I always wanted to write, and I was always reading, and I was always writing lots of letters and scraps of diary material, but that was where I first started writing seriously.
Yeah, fabulous. And our last question for tonight, how would you get away with murder?
Well, I asked my friend James Grieve this, who's the pathologist. James, I think we were doing an event together, and one of the readers asked him, what would your perfect murder be? And I think we were doing it in Shetland. I think he'd come up to do an event with me in Shetland. And he said, well, there are lots of cliffs in Shetland. If you push somebody over a cliff, it's almost impossible to tell whether they slipped or whether they were pushed.
Okay.
And he also said that the biggest killer, certainly in the UK, is a motor vehicle. So if somebody's run over, or if there's an incident with two vehicles, almost impossible to say whether that's accidental or not.
Well, we won't be going driving or cliff walking together. Ann Cleeves, thank you very much for being with us on Murder Mondays.
Thank you. It's been great to chat to you. Great fun.
Thank you, Ann.